Okay, welcome, Mark McCoy, to this session on mind, machines, and brains, and the relationship between those three. I think, we'll solve it today completely. So that's really good.
No more
And Mark,
questions after today.
absolutely none. Yeah, yeah. Do you mind introducing yourself and what made you passionate about psychology? And yeah.
Well, yeah. So, like Justin said, my name is Mark McCoy. I've just completed my first year at the time of this recording, working at Manchester University. I just started in the fall of 2021. My road to deciding to get a PhD in experimental psychology was kind of a strange one, but I guess it kind of boils down to I was originally introduced to this topic in my very last semester of undergraduate work of evolutionary psychology,
Hmm.
and I thought it was a very interesting way, and a really, in my opinion, fascinating way of applying a framework of understanding biology and nature in general to also understanding the human mind, and that led me to further become more interested in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. So I finished my undergraduate and master's work at Oakland University, which is in Michigan. It's in southeast Michigan. But then I finished my doctoral work at Bowling Green State University. They have a really good cognitive neuroscience / cognitive science program, and so I got to work with some really fascinating people who have done work with memory and birds and you know learning in rats, and there was some really good social and cognitive psychologists there as well who work with all different types of game theory models and stuff. But anyway, so I have a pretty broad interest in understanding the mind, and I guess my passion in psychology kind of comes from, I mean, part of it is just that I think that trying to understand the way that human beings engage with one another is just a very, very fascinating, you know, field, and it's a big area. It's like psychology can't just be this little tiny dinky, field, right? It needs to have collaborators from biology and philosophy and anthropology, and it needs all these other people who are trying in history, right? It needs all these different people who are taking all these different perspectives on the human experience and trying to make sense of them, right? It's not as easy, and there's no easy answers. And that's something that I find that a lot of students, they come into psychology thinking, oh, there's going to be easy answers for things. And they find out, oh, a good experiment sometimes explains 17 to 20% of why somebody did something, and we would still consider that to be a good result. But I just think it's fascinating to try and understand some of these huge, ideas about the human experience and the way we move through the world and interact with one another. So, yeah.
No, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we have three questions if we get to them for this session. And the first one, and before doing that, would you mind sharing what your dissertation title was, what that work was?
My dissertation. So my dissertation had to do with something called counterfactual thinking. And counterfactual thinking is this really, in my opinion, fascinating capability that human beings have to think about how we wish the past could have been different, and trying to extrapolate how that could have made things turn out better or worse, right? So a very common way that people will use a counterfactual, is they'll say, oh, well, it's lucky I went to the doctor because if I, for that checkup this year, because if I hadn't, then they wouldn't have caught my cancer, or what, it could have gotten worse, or, I'm lucky I didn't leave for work 5 minutes earlier because then I could have been the one in that horrible car accident I just saw. Lots of time it's like, sometimes they can be frivolous, sometimes they can be very serious, but I was trying to explore how sharing those counterfactual thoughts might be an expression of regret that try to change how people think of you and a decision that you made. Unfortunately, we didn't get super strong results, but hopefully I'm considering trying to do some type of follow-up to see if maybe expressions of regret using counterfactuals can be, you know, if there is something there or not. But regardless,
that's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's, it's not directly related, but in terms of working in the psychoanalytic field, as I am, the idea that you remember the past differently, you remember it, you kind of dismember it, and then you put it back together. And it's not too dissimilar to revising myth, like in the creation stories in Genesis, so that traditions are remembered differently. Yeah, so I think that's something we share, at least a passion for remembering things differently or using them to justify. Yeah, that's fascinating.
And there are some clinical psychologists who study counterfactual thinking as either as some type of byproduct of or correlation with depression and anxiety, right? Like dwelling too much on past failures and mistakes, and how if it had only be different, if I'd only made this decision, or if something had just only gone my way slightly differently, I would be so much happier today, and things would be right, and I wouldn't have all this pressure, and I would have a better job, and I would have gotten married to that person, whatever it might be, and how dwelling on those types of thoughts, could negatively influence our experiences. But yeah, that's a very different topic than the one we have planned for today, but it's an interesting one.
First of our three questions then. Yeah, no, it's good. How appropriate is the computer analogy for understanding the human mind? And related to that sub kind of question is, what is this brain, this mind made of? So again, how appropriate is the computer as an analogy for the human mind?
Yeah, this is one that I think is interesting. It's almost like when you hear people say that like the revolution of the planets is kind of like how atoms exist, because they have this very superficial looking like mapping one to one. But then if you start to do any deep investigation at all, you realize that the analogy kind of like falls apart pretty rapidly, right? So depending on who you talk to or who you read, you will see a lot of different opinions about this, about how good or bad the computer analogy is. Where the analogy is good is that if what you're talking about is thinking about the mind or the brain as a thing that responds to stimuli and has some type of somewhat predictable outcome associated with it, right? So if you look at like, Turing's original idea of what a computer was, right? It was some device that you put an input into. It could just be one button or a sequence of buttons, and then the device would output a series of other response presses as a result, right? So the original idea was, maybe if you press, dot, dot, dash, the computer responds dash, dash, dot, right? It has some type of response based on this predictable input output, right? So one of the ideas where that relates to the human mind, right, is that if the human mind is like a computer, it's that when we have certain inputs, we have certain expected reactions or outputs from the brain, and we should have somewhat reliable reactions or behaviors from people when certain types of stimuli affect them, right? I'm not sure. Hopefully I've made that clear, and it's not like.
Okay. That's really helpful. First, I think what I hear you saying as well is that having predictable outcomes is really important. And my initial skepticism, though also endorsing this kind of way of thinking about it for as an experiment, is that it is I think it might be in trying to impose order in its history, right? As opposed to looking at an analogy, right? And I think there's nothing wrong with that. This imposing order on the human person so that we can understand that person better. I think that has come at the expense of kind of drawing that circle around things that we can describe in a scientific method, but then we lose all this notion of other causes, potential causes, um, teleology, the kind of the science or the philosophical study, theological study of the end to what we are directed towards. My consistent example is I'm going to pick up this coffee, and there's a lot of ways you could understand neurologically why I'm doing that, but the better description might be because I like the taste of it, and which is a phenomenological, a subjective phenomenon, right? An experience. So do you think in the development of the computer as analogy for the human brain, do you think there were motivations for that beyond yeah, well, yeah, say more.
Well, I think so. I guess I'll say that when where the analogy really breaks down is when people try to think of when you hear people say, well, yeah, so this part of the brain is like the processor of a computer or something like that, right? When you look at a computer, right, a computer is made up of hardware which is able to run different software programs, right? And the software programs aren't necessarily dependent on any one specific part of the computer, right? Like if you're going to play a video game, you need some type of processor, you need a power supply, you need the GPU, you need some memory to store inputs that have been put in to the video game, right? Basically, the entire computer is needed at different points to run it, to run the software, right? That's not really how the brain or the mind function, right? They're kind of functioning at a different level, which some people call wetware, which is like, instead of, it would be more like if there was a computer made up of parts and each of those parts had specific software that only they could run or they specialized in running. So that was where I wanted to mention how the analogy falls apart. Now, getting to the motivation element, I think it's an interesting question. Part of it could be to try to increase the sophistication of thinking about the mind and psychology, right? Like I know that during the cognitive revolution in the 1960s and 70s, right, there was this move away from the behaviorist approach in the 1950s and 40s, which took this really strong, there is not, the human is a human being is born, and they're 100% reliant on being fed things, and then their brain absorbing it all in some sponge-like capacity, and then we just become these robots that kind of react to things that we've seen before, and there's nothing kind of built in that would predict behavior. And so the reaction by people like Noam Chomsky and a lot of the early cognitive psychologists was to push back on that and say, no, the brain is more like a computer, which has these specialized functions. So originally, they were fighting this uphill battle against these conceived notions that human beings are like these robots that have been taught things through their everyday experiences growing up, right? So the analogy was, it had a purpose, and it's probably run its course, is kind of what, what it sounds like. I don't know if you're suggesting that or not, but it doesn't really hold up by a lot of standards of what we think about as a modern computer or what we know about the mind nowadays.
Well, yeah, I think what would be helpful is, I don't know, do computers, do you think that they think? Do we, yeah.
Well, I mean, not that I'm aware of. I mean, but it's an interesting question of like, what is thinking, right? And I guess that kind of gets into the second question that we kind of had, which is kind of like this idea of the easy versus hard problems of consciousness, right? which is that it's easy for us, and it's kind of tongue in cheek, right? Because you say, oh, it's easy to understand how perception works. It's actually really, really complicated how perception works, right? But it's kind of tongue in cheek in that if you say that's the easy bit, you realize that the hard bit is like really, really hard. But the hard bit is really that subjective experience bit, right? And like trying to understand, how it is that we all have these unique experiences, and we don't really know if they map onto one another one to one. I can know that you're experiencing the same wavelength of light that I am, but I have no idea if the phenomenological experience that you are internalizing is the same as me. And that's the really hard part, is trying to get at that difference of understanding the differences between what's going on in two people's heads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's strange because we think of the brain as this kind of objective part of the human person, and many philosophical schools, but you're right, not as popular today, though at least in pop culture it is, right? But that we think of the human brain as the objective side of this subjective experience. So we can see it objectively, but it doesn't translate into what it feels like, which is incredible. I mean, you will never get pepper from smelling the neurons that are firing when I'm smelling pepper. You will never see it. So I wonder sometimes, not sometimes, let me just say it outright. I think that we are, because we've created a narrow focus of the questions we can answer, because consciousness does not fit in, or the subjective experience does not fit into that sterile, situation, we don't talk about it. And it's refreshing to hear you and other colleagues like, this is a problem that's not going away. Does my brain think? Do I think with my brain? These are difficult questions. And, I'm looking at a camera right now, and I know, very confident, that it's not thinking anything. It has no intentionality. And yet for a long time, I confess, I thought of the human person that way, for at least 5 to, well, more like 10 years, and trying to figure this out for myself, how that works. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't really answer your question about, from my opinion, of whether or not computers are thinking. But I guess I would say no, but they are processing, right? Whereas we could say that the human brain is processing, but it is also thinking, right? And there's a lot of different there's different elements that are involved with that. And the subjective one, I think, is a really interesting facet. The subjective experiences are a really interesting facet of that. And kind of an example that I really like, or kind of a thought experiment, I'm not sure if you've heard it or not. I think it's called like Mary's Room. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Mary's Room? No, I know the Chinese room experiment.
Yeah.
Mary's Room. Tell me more. Yeah.
So it's this thought experiment of, and maybe I'm getting the name wrong, but it's this thought experiment of, if there's this girl named Mary who lives in a room that only has black and white colors in it, or it doesn't even need to be black and white, but it could be all colors but the color red. And then she basically, over the first 25 years of her life, not experiencing the color red, she learns everything there is to know about human vision and experiencing colors, but not actually experiencing the color red herself, right? And then after these 25 years of basically having a PhD level deep dive focus in understanding how we experience light and color, she leaves the room and the first thing she sees is a bright red rose, right? And the question is she having a new experience, right? And I think most people's knee-jerk reaction to that is, yes, of course she is, because nothing beats the experience of the thing, right? You can know everything that there is about the hard data of, what it is the color is, how the mind reacts to it, how different neurons fire, and the pathway of light going from the eye to the visual cortex, and then from the visual cortex, down the ventral pathway for us to process it and understand what we're looking at. But nothing beats actually experiencing it for yourself, right? Of course she has to learn something new, right? Because she hasn't seen it before. So that subjective experience piece is incredibly vital for us to experience the world and have a shared experience, in spite of the fact that those subjective experiences are probably slightly different and we don't know if they're exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. In preparation for this, you and I, we at least reviewed some of Daniel Dennett's work on consciousness. Not that this conversation is about that, but he has this sense where you have a series of unconscious processes that kind of combine in some kind of orchestra. They compete for the one that's going to be most influential, and essentially the one that wins. It comes very close to eliminativism, to eliminate consciousness from the picture. He would not say he does that, but it comes really darn close to it. But that it's kind of an accretion of lower level processes that once they reach a certain magical threshold, which he would call natural, we're conscious, right? And that really we shouldn't take seriously this consciousness, except that we can attend to it seriously. It is a user illusion, if I remember how he put it.
Yeah, so it's Daniel Dennett is an interesting philosopher, and he's interesting to me because I have always thought, I feel like I'm always having a different read on what he's saying than other people. And so I don't know if that means that, maybe I'm just giving him what he's saying too much stock. But I think what the heart of what he's getting at, and some of these ideas I'm also borrowing from Steven Pinker. But yeah, basically the idea that you're kind of getting at is that if you really look at the way that the brain works, right? And this gets to a question that we haven't really addressed that you had brought up at the beginning, which if the brain isn't a computer, then what is it, right? At some point, all these neurons, which have a very specific function, right? Steven Pinker calls them dumb demons, right? He says that they're just these little dumb things that have only one thing that they each can do, right? So for example, we have these visual neurons that are solely responsible for seeing bars of light in a particular orientation. That's all they do, right? So one of these neurons, if it sees a bar of light like this, right, that neuron will activate, right? If the bar of light comes in like this, that neuron, it basically is living in a world as if it's not seeing anything. But then there's another neuron that is responsible for seeing bars of light in this orientation that does turn on, right? And then we have other neurons that are responsible for motion, right? And then we have other neurons that are responsible for trying to determine the textural, what the texture of an object looks like, the color, right? And so I think what Dan Dennett is suggesting, right, this is my best interpretation of this idea of our experiences being an illusion, is that somehow our brain is taking all of these incredibly simple, as Steven Pinker says, incredibly dumb recordings from the world, and it's putting them together for us in a seemingly nonstop continuous experience, right? So the illusion is that it does that when we experience the world, it is this continuous flow state, right? We know from studying the way that the brain works neurologically that it doesn't experience everything in that holistic of a fashion, right? And that gets to another area of trying to understand the brain that is so difficult, is that we do experience the world in this very holistic way, right? you can simultaneously feel an itch in your foot while you're typing on the computer, listening to a song that you like, right? And feeling like you're hungry, right? You can have all these experiences simultaneously that give you this feeling of being in this one particular moment, right? And the illusion is that it does feel like they're all glued together, even though at a neurological level, they're all being processed at a different hierarchy and not even at the same time, but they're all put together. And there's actually this really new research, which has recently discovered neurons, which they're calling binding neurons now, which are responsible for trying to attach all of the different stimuli that we are attending to at any given moment of our existence and putting them together into that kind of holistic experience. And they've only just discovered these in the last couple of years, these binding neurons.
And so that's a potential solution for unifying the kind of the technical term the field of apperception, right? So that it appears to one subject. Is that
well,
what some of the research is pursuing?
Yeah. So I've kind of skirted around this just now, this idea in cognitive science, which is called the binding problem, which is this idea that, we have all these experiences and the brain doesn't process things in a kind of serial manner. It does it in a parallel manner, right? And then somehow it puts all of these things that it's broken down into all these different compartments and it reconnects them together. And so the binding problem of consciousness is really how we're having not just, like if you're having a one-on-one conversation with a person, right? You can look at the person's face and you can see that they're talking to you and you can hear the words that they're saying. And the way that most people would report experiencing this conversation is they would say, yeah, he's speaking and I'm hearing the words and, and then I have I think of something to say in response, right? If we're having some kind of flow of conversation. Mm-hmm. But when you look at it from a neurological perspective, right, you're seeing a person's mouth and facial features move before you're hearing the words, right? But there's something neurologically that's pinning those things together, right? And then you have a response that feels incredibly natural and of the moment to say, but neurologically, your response and the words you're using seem to be primed and coming from some part of our brain that we wouldn't call the conscious part of our experience, right? So all of these different little problems I've mentioned have to do with this idea of understanding how it is that we are experiencing the world on a moment-to-moment basis.
Yeah, I think that remains the great mystery for me, is just the unity of perception, right? That the world is my mind is always about the world. It reaches out towards it. It doesn't just receive it. I mean, certainly the reception of, photons and so on, as you were just talking about in the eye, but my mind is always moving outwards, either through curiosity or that it's about the world. It doesn't just reflect the world. And, it could be helpful, Rene Descartes, the great philosopher that inaugurates the modern age of Western philosophy. I think we lost a lot in that domain, that substance dualism, right? Which you're obviously quite familiar with, that there's mental phenomena and then there's physical phenomena. And that those can be correlated in some manner. That's a departure from the ancient perspective on the world. Not that they're all consistent by any means, but for the Platonic tradition or the Jewish and Christian and Islamic tradition that inherited Plato and Aristotle, that the psyche, the soul, was not something that you had, but it was the form. It's form of the body, right? It's the form of the person, and that it's a little closer to Bertrand Russell as this. There's one stuff, but it's somehow it can when it's wrapped around itself, it can see itself. I mean, it's like a Mobius strip. You're walking on one side of it, and suddenly you end up on the other side, but you don't know how that happened. And so the soul wouldn't be something that one has, but rather it is the entire person. So I remember there was a author, Sam Harris, that wrote a relatively silly book, I think called Free Will, and using this sense that because, before a decision is made, people would click on these things, and then they would say, okay, that, we can tell in your brain you already were doing what you were going to do before you were consciously aware of that. And thereby then making the argument that you don't have free will, despite that doesn't work, as he admits, when you're a parent. And, like, oh, don't worry about it. It's not your free will. But the reason I bring that up is that bifurcating, dividing the mental and the physical created a series of issues that some of the ancient world didn't deal with, right? That doesn't mean their metaphysics are right, but they didn't limit the kind of questions that we can have. So I think of that just theologically and philosophically, that they might have something to share. And of all people, Bertrand Russell, this great philosopher, for him to endorse that perspective was news to me. I mean, I did not know that. But that way you have the unity of consciousness is because this kind of the form of the person is their entire form, like this kind of full intentionality that can't be removed from the material. It is the kind of in a certain way, it's far more scientific thinking of a plant that way. Anyway, I just figured I'd share that.
No, it's interesting that you say that. I mentioned to you, yesterday when we were just chatting before we recorded the podcast, that I've been reading a little bit of Oliver Sacks. And for anybody who might be listening, Oliver Sacks was a neurologist who was also an incredible writer, who would write about all these interesting case studies that he encountered of people who had different neurological deficits or brain damage. And he would talk about the interesting ways that it would fundamentally alter the way that a person experienced the world. But he also talks about trying to understand people in a way that's similar to what the way you're talking right now, right? He would say that, as a physician, he says this several times in many of his essays, that you're not just trying to look at a person and say, okay, this person, this part of this person's brain has been damaged, right? And we're going to focus on that particular element of his life, right? He was also interested in how this affected this person's outlook on life, how they felt in the moment, in every moment. He was curious how it affected their spiritual life, right? He was curious how it affected, everything, right? He didn't just ask people about their symptoms and things related to their symptoms, right? He would talk to people about, what's it like when you hold your child now that you've had this car accident, or you've had this change to your brain, right? He wanted to understand how it affected everything, how they felt love, right? How they prayed, he took a very holistic, whole view of trying to understand the human experience. And I do think that there's this unfortunate move that we have taken, maybe as a science, or I don't know if there's any one person you can say it's their fault, right? But it's this trying to focus too intensely on solely the objective experiences, right? I mentioned the cognitive revolution earlier, right? But like a lot of the cognitive psychologists, the early ones, they wanted to create an objective science, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there is a value to that, but we shouldn't. We can't exclude. We can't say, well, to understand this part of a human experience, we can only look at this broad, narrow region of experience because that's the only area that is considered objective by some arbitrary standard that we've decided upon, right? So I just brought up a lot of different ideas there, but I'm basically agreeing with you that we need to take a more whole view of human beings, right? But it can be challenging because we're incredibly complicated. But we can't forget that when we're talking about consciousness or any particular experience that a person might be having, that it's not just affecting one part of their life, right? What else could it be affecting or bleeding in through, or yeah. Anyway, I feel like I'm repeating myself now, but
No, that's helpful just to orbit around the question, because it remains forever evacuating. And I appreciate his work in the sense that to study those who have dealt with traumas or serious physical ailments with the brain can teach us so much about what it means to be human. Think of those occasions with the split brain patients and all the philosophical conundrums that go with that. I mean, if I take my right side of my brain and I put it in we switch that with each other. What would that be? Are these different perceptions joined into one? There's a lot that the people that suffer can teach us the most. And I appreciate you thinking of that, or offering that.
yeah.
Wanted
Yeah,
to
I mean,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I was just thinking of another, and going back to our conversation earlier about memory, right? Like, one interesting case study. There's been several people that have had this problem, but there are lots of people who have damage to a part of their brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for helping them to form new long-term memories. And so for example, in his investigation of people with this type of problem, Oliver Sacks would find people who seemingly are that illusion that we were talking about earlier of our life being this one continuous connected flow seems to be broken in a sense, right? Where, because they can't form new long-term memories, it seems as if they're constantly moving through these detached bits of experience. But because they can't recall even experiences that they just had moments ago, it seems that there is this break there, right? But then he would observe these people do something that they knew very well. And in the case of one patient, it was go to regular church services, and he could follow along with the entire mass and seem to be very moved by the entire experience, right? Or playing games that he deeply understood the rules to, right? He could really invest in a game of chess or some other competitive activity, and in that time when he was investing in that experience, he seemed to be like reattaching to some whole experience again before he would return back to that kind of scary existential nightmare of like not experiencing life as this continuous process, right? So anyway, just an interesting case study I thought I would mention that kind of involves a couple of the ideas that we have talked about. But
no, that's really helpful. Some of the early church fathers spoke of thinking of the human life as a strand that kind of extends. And I never heard it put that way, of having it broken up in different ways. And this is part of that identity problem that, of course, in the brain and the mind bring that up, where if a boat, I forget who came up with the idea, but a ship leaves New York and it's going to go around the world, and it's, as soon as it hits Africa, its mast needs to be replaced. The deck needs to be replaced. When it goes, around the Horn of Africa towards Southeast Asia, then it's got to remove all its sails and replace that. By the time it returns to New York, there's not one part of it that's the same. And the question would be, is that the same person? And I've always enjoyed those debates with students about whether that is, and then you're thinking about form and matter there in this kind of classic. And I'm deeply skeptical of any kind of opposition between mind and matter, form and substance. In a certain way, we still live in a sexualized universe where you have almost everything in science boils down to this male female yin and yang kind of experience where we're still in these bifurcated, divided polarities. And I think that sciences, the philosophical world, theological world, has to move in a direction where we can think psychoanalytically there to move beyond um, the one and the many. So we're kind of reproducing that in each of our disciplines. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. That's yeah, it's very yeah. I'm sorry, I'm trying to piece together a bunch of different ideas at once. Um, but but no, that's called that idea of the ship, right? Isn't that's called the ship of Theseus, right? That
yes, yes, yes.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. That's something where again, right? We could look where most people, I feel like, would claim or suggest that they are the same person, right? If you were to say, okay, from the moment you were born to today, or from the first time you drove a car to today, or whatever it might be, right? Like, are you the same person? I feel like most people would feel like the answer is yes, right? But there's lots of evidence, right, that suggests that our cells are constantly changing, they're dying, they're reproducing. Um, um, you know, you could even look at from a social psychology and a personality psychology perspective and say, well, our personalities aren't even really as stable as we feel like they are, right? Um, there is some stability, but it fluctuates on kind of like a spectrum, right? Um, and so it seems like there's an incredible amount of evidence that would point to fundamentally no, like the ship, we are not the same person once we arrive at our destination, but that's not what it feels like. You know, that's not the that's not what the lived experience tends to ascribe feeling to, right? Um,
Yeah. So what do you think it is that we would, our next question, which we'll get to here, is, uh, what makes understanding consciousness so difficult? Uh, is you said, that's not how it feels. And I think we're trained to take what I think is the most primordial fact of human existence, that the world appears to me, and we're taught to leave that on like the back burner because it is not objective. But it's still evidence, right? Like the fact that I feel that. I mean, I'm not going to go to someone and say, no, you don't feel pain, right? Like, nope, I looked at your brain. I know that you don't feel pain. And that's a tough thing to do, but you said it. Like, I am the same person that I was when I was 15. I have changed, but I am still the same person, not in the sense of some kind of divine spark that's bouncing around in here or something like that, right? But rather to understand the human person holistically as a life that is lived. If there's anything consistent in the great perennial classical theistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Advaita Vedanta, and so on, is that this is not a problem. The human person is created, is made in order to live a life of virtue, to to have those moments of suffering, to overcome them. And I think if we, yeah, I mean, because I used to say I would not get into the Star Trek transporter system. Granted, I still wouldn't, but if I lived in that universe, I definitely would. But it's not a big of an issue because it's very clear to me that the materiality can change, but I'm more intrigued by the fact that the world remains consistent, and that is revelatory, theophanic, as the ancients would think. It's an appearance of of the functioning of a mind, right? Why is consciousness so difficult? Is because the world is so transparent to it, right? We can understand it and grapple with it, not solve it. And the world reflects our mind and vice versa. This is a perennial intuition, but one today that is not taken very seriously, right? And I think Douglas Hoffman had a wonderful book, Reality Isn't Real. I forget what it was, but we'll put it up. And that we've evolved not to see truth, but we've evolved to be able to survive. And I think it's a really fun book. Kant would be much better, but more difficult to read in terms of that. Yeah. So anyway, these are some spontaneous thoughts that I have there, where we tend to remove the mystery and think what we can think within a particular game.
Yeah, going off of what you were saying about, like most people would feel like, if they won the lot, like if you went and bought a lottery ticket and became a millionaire tomorrow, right? Most people would say, oh, your life would be fundamentally different forever, right? But a year after winning the lottery, you would probably report feeling similar to you do today, the day before you won the lottery, right? You might have this incredible high for maybe several weeks or several months, where you now are like basking in this newfound wealth and new luxurious lifestyle that you can live. But you're eventually going to go back to this state of feeling like, you still have problems, right? And you still have, you would still experience suffering, even though you're now a wealthier person, right? Which isn't to say that, you wouldn't become a more privileged person who's now suffering, right? But you would still be somebody who has the capacity to suffer and feel anxiety or stress, or be worried about your health, or whatever it might be, right? Like you might have different problems, but they would still be problems, and you would still feel the same as if before you won the lottery, right? And there's a similar phenomenon with people who have serious health complications, where they say, it's never going to be the same after this. And then over time, people typically adapt, right? And they might say, yeah, before I got injured or before I had this problem, my life was better, but we adjust, right? We get used to this new normal, and then we kind of return to this kind of base rate, right? Which, Jan Dennett would say is the illusion of feeling like we're this constant person, right? But we would return to some type of level of feeling like we are, we would become, I'm having trouble putting a word to it, but we would return to our general sense of ourselves.
Well, that we're not finished for our second question just yet, but in terms of time, and because we just mentioned it, there is the third one is consciousness an illusion? And as you mentioned that, and Daniel Dennett's fascinating work, I find it compelling, and then I realize he's asking me to deny what is most undeniable. And as you just said, I mean, how in the world, even if consciousness is a user illusion, you can't have an illusion unless it appears to someone, right? You can't have an hallucination hallucinate itself. That just made itself real? It's a virtual entity. It's not a thing, but it is deeply real, right? So if there was an example, forget who put it, but it was a total flight simulator, if you heard this one. So it's basically a flight simulator that generates the pilot within itself, and then it flies the plane. But that's not the same as what's going on in our brains, because we feel it. You can't have an illusion unless you have some kind of subjective awareness, which, for that second question, why it's so mysterious, consciousness, is because we are asking ourselves to take not a leap of faith, but really a cognitive dissonance, or as I would like to say, what we don't want to know, right? Is that, how do you take stuff in this dreary, stale world, right, where there's only formal causes and material causes and some efficient causes, right? We don't think of final causes, intentionality, right? And so on. How do we take that lump of matter and make it know that it's there? And this is the solution that is, at least, and these are not theists, but that and serious cognitive neuroscientists are doing this. The notion of panpsychism, that consciousness must be akin to this, strong nuclear force. It's just a property of matter, and if you kind of roll it up enough and make it complex enough, boop, there comes consciousness, right? Like, or the consciousness can know itself. And whatever that solution will be, it shows us that the problem of the last two questions, right? They're deeply related. How do you get stuff to know that it's there? Yeah.
No, yeah, that's like $1 million question, and I don't have any answer, any response to that that's going to be satisfactory. But it is interesting, that on the one hand, we can have all of these neurons, and I mentioned earlier, that are each doing incredibly simple things that somehow create this seemingly infinitely complex identity, right? That they kind of house within it, right? But then we can also shear some of those things away, right? And a person can still feel conscious, even though they've now lost maybe a significant portion of those bits that were required to give them consciousness in the first place, right? So, yeah, it's a deeply confounding question. I will say though that and again, I hope we're not. I don't want it to come off like we're just making this whole podcast about ideas that Dan Dennett has talked about before. But you also mentioned, I don't know if you saw any of his rebuttals to Sam Harris's book Free Will, which you also mentioned, but
no.
Dan Dennett actually deeply disagrees with Sam Harris's opinions about free will. And it sounds like, from my understanding, and also in my opinion as well, the reasoning is that because it feels as if the decisions that we're making are important, right? And when we make these decisions, they give us value, right? Dan Dennett has argued, unless he's recently changed his opinion, but from what I've seen in the past, he's argued that because we fret over decisions that we need to make, even frivolous ones, and because they are impactful to us, we should still say that they're meaningful and that our consciousness is doing something, even if there's something pulling the strings that we can't see, right, behind it a little bit, right? Because it still has meaning to us, and because it feels like we could have made another decision instead of the one we made. He's argued that there's still a free will there in spite of that. I don't know if you have a reaction to that or not, but
I think that is good news. I mean, I appreciate that. And I wonder, when you said we should, to what extent is that free will, right? And I think we shouldn't, at least philosophically and theologically, we shouldn't think of free will just as choices. They're not logic gates. When you choose a lover, you don't, hopefully, I wouldn't consider it really love if you're just saying, I want to list a series of features of someone I want, and then that's it. Like there's something else that happens, and the term there is falling, and we have there's so many different ways that we relate to people, and it just struck me when you said, for him it feels that way, right? Like that it does something. And there's just a lot of magic that happens in his universe, which I am intrigued by. And it's ironic, because I lived in a world for a long time, as I told you, that I really bought into that. But there was, it really is basically saying there's a certain level where a lot of little things happen, and then eventually, boom, consciousness emerges. And that argument just doesn't seem to be satisfactory to me anymore. I just don't know how you get lifeless stuff. How do you get an electron to know that it's there? And we can't. But if somehow a collection of them, they know they're there, this sounds really spooky, right? This sounds like the, kind of new agey kind of stuff. And that's not the position that I'm pursuing here. But I do want to highlight again the way in which we're asked to ignore what is most obvious. And that is evidence that the world appears. You can't get, though the brain has connections and it can look like, between neurons and so on, the way that a circuit is going to look, but there's no semantic value there. By semantics, we mean meaning, not syntax, right? Just the rules. And John Searle's famous thought experiment, which I won't do any justice to, but if you're in a room and you don't understand Chinese and someone sends in, a message asking you something in Chinese and you don't know what it means, but then you have an instruction book next to you that says, if you see this line, write that. If you see that squiggle, write that one. And you do that and you spit it out. So this is his version of like a Turing test, right? And you're outside the machine and you're going to think, wow, this person might speak Chinese, right? But there's no semantic value. It's only syntax, that fancy word for the kind of the order of the words, right? The rules of the combination of those words, but there's no semantic value. So there's still some way in which the human person is able to sense meaning, to contend with meaning. And I think psychology, this is one of my pet projects, would do well to recover the Greek notion of the nous, N-O-U-S, which is that intuitive function of the human person. The mathematician that does have a sense that something is true, but has yet to prove it. Like what kind of knowing is that? Or, I mean, it's deeply alarming when someone says, I just knew that he was the one for me, and I think, ooh, that's deeply noetic. But there's something that we have that's irreducible there, I think, to its constituent parts. So semantic value is being really important to me. How do you get meaning into a meaningless system?
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if, which isn't to say that we shouldn't pursue trying to understand consciousness or why consciousness is, but, and it could just be that we don't have good enough technology to understand it at the level that is required, or maybe there are elements that we're missing, or I don't know, but there is not a satisfactory answer as to why this special sequence of neurons we have creates a mind.
Well, can we just invert that for a second, just as a thought experiment?
Sure.
And then we'll close up in just a moment, just to think about, this analogy of the cell phone as opposed to just a computer, but that the cell phone that I'm looking at now is also beyond its physical limitations. It interacts with things beyond that. Now, this sounds silly. I know, The Men That Stare at Goats, that movie, and so on. But rather, is it that the brain gives rise to consciousness, and we're not going to solve this today, or does consciousness use this brain? In the way that you use a cell phone, and certain things that are damaged, then it doesn't work in terms of memory recall and so on. I wonder, I don't know, have you ever thought about inverting that question?
Well, I mean, coming from a biological perspective, I guess I'm more primed to think of the matter as coming first, right?
Me too.
So it's harder to imagine consciousness imposing some order onto neurons to make it to attach to it. So yeah, and again, this could be something that is another type of logical problem. Is we have a certain, we are conscious creatures that are wondering about our own ability to ask the question, right? Like it's really challenging to get at these types of questions because we have such a limited scope, right? Um, it's, yeah, we have a very, we have a, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure that there are some cognitive neuroscientists out there that would be appalled that I would, that I could, maybe it's some of the things I'm suggesting. I hope not, but it's
that might show us that this is what critical thinking is that that science, philosophy, economics, none of that is done in a vacuum, and there are still ideological commitments. And I shared that I have a hard time even inverting that question, but it's important to do it as a critical thinker. And we can't, the human person that perceives the subjective experience is the one thing that was not allowed into, it became the exception to nature. Whereas prior to that, the universe, the world was permeated, filled with intentions and final causes, purposes. So you just took a drink of something, and that the purpose was the final cause, right? And then you have these other things that are in between that. And it doesn't mean that the intention is the only thing that matters, but that they're all related, right? They're embedded within each other, and it's a much more holistic way of looking at the world. I mean, I can't imagine going in the future, in 200 years from now, when you were saying maybe one day we'll understand. I just don't think that it is possible. I think there's a category difference between subjective experience and third person perspective. I don't think those are, they're not interchangeable. But so if we imagine that the world has purposes and those are also relevant, we can generate that more holistic kind of perspective. But I lost where I was going with that, but it wasn't that good.
No, I part of the problem too might be that the only way that we have really to communicate a lot of these issues is through language, which is itself and not able to fully capture the internal experience of an individual, right? So if I told you that I was thinking, like if I told you, oh, I really enjoyed our conversation today, you might have a different conception of what I even mean by saying that, right? Even though it's such a simple sentence, right? Like your conception of every word and the totality of all of the words might be very different than what I meant, right? Maybe you came away from the conversation feeling bad about it, and so you think I was being sarcastic, right? Or maybe you have a very similar one, but so at the end of the day, right, we rely on trying to have these thoughts about what it is that we're doing using a medium of expressing those thoughts that does not have the capacity to capture the totality of the experience, right? There's not a word I can say to you that tells you exactly how much pain I'm experiencing. I can tell you I'm in a lot of pain, but it doesn't give you that full knowledge. So I might rely on an analogy or something to try to give it to you, or to express that thought to you.
Well, that reminds me of what I didn't finish on, because it's related to that, which is if I went, 100 years from now and we had made all these advances and I said, hey, doc, I'm just, I'm heartbroken. And they'd say, no, you're not. Neuron XYZ is firing and we'll fix that, right? It would be a very different way of thinking of the human person. And now, granted, that could fix that. I mean, it could, but it doesn't mean that the intention is also not authentic, right? Or real. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think of, I don't know if you've ever read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. It was turned into the movie Blade Runner, but there's a great bit in the book that isn't really focused on in the movie, where a lot of the characters have these, they plug into these, basically these emotion delivery devices, and they're like, I feel like being depressed today, and so they'll dial into a depressed mood and just wallow in depression until they feel like they're done being depressed, and then they turn the dial into a happier mood, like and to me that seems like an existential nightmare, right, of figuring out, fine tuning it to that point where we could just decide, I feel like being happy, therefore I'm going to make these changes to my brain to elicit that response, right? I hope that we don't get to that point, or at least if we do, we're very careful about how we tread once we do, because that to me seems like a nightmare.
That's a deeply psychoanalytic point, right? Because we don't, as much as we say we want to just be happy, we want to struggle and strive. And I mean, my poor Cubs fan friends, they were waiting to win all this time, and then they won, and now they're like everyone else, and that's too bad. Like, and the last thing I wanted to say when you brought up language is what makes us thoroughly unnatural. And I say that because it creates, if we think of being as like stuff, of which I don't, but if we did that, right, just kind of material stuff, language creates a partner that runs beside it. So who I am, right now, constitutively, I am who I am, but I'm the Justin that's missing this particular person that I used to date, for example. Who I am without that person is different than who I am without that person. Like these virtual things that make us this a subject that's lacking something, and depending on what a person is lacking, they will change. Now we can't see it, right? Maybe even in a kind of physical sense, but to lack something and different kinds of lacking create these other kind of virtually real partners, right? Entities that are with there. So in terms of depression, of what is missing, at least, well, in the French psychoanalytic tradition, depression would be much more associated with the fact that nothing is missing and there's nothing to be had, and hence the melancholy that follows.
That's a deeply depressing thought.
Well, or that it also is, Martin Heidegger, woke me from my slumber of not seeing the world as totally fortuitous. I mean, it's a gift. It doesn't even have to be from someone, but just the sense that things exist, and consistently so. One doesn't have to go theologically there, and he doesn't, is a wonder that I think it'd be important for us to recover. There's, and I appreciate speaking with you, the holistic dimension that you bring with, not despite, but just because in terms of the field, to have a deeply mechanical approach sometimes, and then to speak to someone like you that has this much more holistic perspective and are open to kind of critical thinking like that is refreshing. And who knows what it will yield. And it's absolutely fascinating. And I can't wait to hear more about this counterfactual research and, what that might mean.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully some, I felt like this was an interesting conversation, and hopefully somebody else does. But I mean, yeah, it's part of the problem when you ask questions that either don't have easy answers, or maybe don't have an answer, period, is sometimes all we can do is look at different perspectives on the question, right? And that's all we really have available to us. And yeah, so hopefully hopefully it wasn't just a complete mess of different ideas. Hopefully there's some
no, I think it'll be
a lot of this.
I think it's really neat. And that's a great note to end on, in the sense that there is a joy in the fact that, like, being and mind or brain and mind don't coincide perfectly, because it means that there's something else for us to look for, and which means that there's more to read about, more to do research on, and we don't want to be like the Cubs and finally get it. Because if I am just my brain, then I think I'm going to disappear as this experience right now. So with you, I agree. I don't want someone zapping my brain and making me smell pepper. Well, maybe occasionally, but but yeah. So, well, is there a final word that you wanted to share before we close up here?
No, I mean, I feel like we've covered quite a bit of ideas, and I'm perfectly fine at leaving it at that. We started to get into language, and that's a whole other mess of ideas that we could dive into for probably hours. And there's a lot here that I think is of interest. And if yeah, there's plenty of books that people could, if they were interested, could look into any of these different topics at a very granular level. And so, maybe some of the philosophers and scientists we've named, if anybody out there is listening is interested, those could be a good place to start. Even if like me and Justin have said, if we disagree with some of them, reading their ideas can still help you to get the full picture, even if you end up having read a book disagreeing with it, you still understand another popular take or another set of ideas. So,
and we'll put a link for a number of those: Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Oliver Sacks, and others. I think that'll be really good for people that are interested.
yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining, and yeah, I look forward to hearing more about your research going forward. It's really cool.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.